Hi, everybody. I'm Erika Sanzi, Director of Outreach here at Parents Defending Education. Thank you so much for joining us. I am extra excited for our guest today because, in addition to all of the accolades, which I will list in a moment, he has been a personal friend of mine for about 10 years, which I consider to be a blessing. Robert Pondiscio is our guest today. Robert is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of the book, How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. And most importantly, Robert is a girl dad, very unlike me, since I am a boy mom. Robert, so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I've got full girl dad credentials because I functionally raise my daughter as a son, and I actually shouldn't say that given gender politics right now. She's an athlete. She works at Barstool Sports. I mean, she has probably more testosterone than I do.
Well, I'm still calling you a girl dad because you got to raise a daughter. I don't have a daughter. The closest thing I have a daughter is when the girlfriend of my son hangs out at our house. It is the best time for me because it's finally somebody willing to talk about all the small petty stuff that my kids never want to talk about.
Yeah, I talk about football with my daughter.
Yeah, so she would fit in very well at my house, actually. In fact, my new thing every Sunday, because my youngest has his friends over to watch the NFL games because we have Red Zone so they can watch all the games. My new thing is I just have to pick up a bunch of frozen pizzas every weekend and then you just cook them all, cut them, and I just put a giant cutting board with pizza out because otherwise, the other day it was a whole pack of hot dogs cut up into little pieces with toothpicks. And I just brought those into the room. So anyway.
So now that I know that you have NFL Red Zone, next time my Buffalo Bills are blacked out because for some reason people in New York want to see a New Jersey team, the New York Jets, instead of the New York's only football team, I'll be showing up in your family room to watch the Bills.
You are always welcome. There will be a pile of laundry for you to sit on. Don't worry. Okay, so getting into what we're going to talk about today. And it's going to be a lot of things because Robert knows a lot of things and has a ton of experience. In addition to working at the American Enterprise Institute, in addition to obviously having raised his own daughter, in addition to founding something called Knowledge Matters, which he's going to talk about, he was also a 5th grade teacher in the Bronx, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's true. Okay. PS 277, the shining star of District 7.
So anyway, so he brings a wealth of knowledge to this. And one of the other things that I most love about Robert, and I think is hugely important when we're talking about what's happening in K-12 education currently, is that as all of the viewers, I'm guessing, have noticed, political partisanship is sort of at a very high point for us right now. Polarization is...
I hadn't noticed.
We're very polarized. The tribalism, it just, to me, it all seems, I'm sure it's not unprecedented, but in my lifetime, it feels unprecedented. And so Robert calls balls and strikes. He doesn't pledge allegiance to any political party. He doesn't pledge allegiance to any sort of tribe. He's going to tell you what he thinks. And that is something that's going to make a lot of his friends happy on Monday and really pissed off on Tuesday. He and I actually have this in common. So anyway, so for that reason, also, it's a great conversation because even in this, the stuff that we at Parents Defending Education do, and as we watch conversations out there, unfortunately, it does feel way too tribal and politically partisan at times. And I remain convinced, and I'm pretty sure that you agree, that at the end of the day, that does not help kids at all.
Yeah. I mean, I've said for years, at the end of the day, I think of myself, my role in education is I'm a literacy guy first and foremost. And until or unless there's a, Republican or Democratic, conservative or progressive way to teach kids how to read, then I think it's important to hold on to that. I mean, there's 44 phonemes and both parties use all of them. So, it is what it is.
Right. And for people who may not know this, it is important to note that I'm pretty sure right now about 2/3 of American students, aren't considered proficient readers, or they're not reading on grade level. There's different measures for that. So, we have a crisis that involves quite literally, can our children read? And for Robert, that's kind of always been the house that's on fire, and that's where his focus is. Okay. So I want to start talking a little bit about this idea of knowledge-rich curriculum, because I know that our community here at PDE obviously cares deeply about their kids being successful in school. They want to be sure that what the report card says actually tells the truth. So if they think that their kid is on grade level or doing well, they want to be able to believe that. And I know that you were the co-founder of something called Knowledge Matters. So my question
Yep.
is, why did you start it? What is it? And why are you such a champion of this idea of knowledge-rich curriculum?
A real simple answer. So I was, I alluded to my teaching, or you did, in the Bronx. So just to paint the picture for you, I taught for 5 years at PS 277 in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the South Bronx. If you know the New York City school system, it's actually a behemoth. It's made up of 32 different community school districts. District 7, the South Bronx, is the lowest scoring district in New York City. My school, PS 277, was, and I think still is, the lowest scoring school in District 7. So, I had a front row seat teaching 5th grade at literally the lowest of the low, as it were. I mean, there were other schools in the city that were worse, outliers, but this was the poorest performing school in the poorest performing district. And as I've said so many times in the last 20 years, the one guy who described what I saw every day in that classroom was a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr. of core knowledge fame. Half the books sitting behind me were probably written by Hirsch. He described, or just to compare and contrast. So our school was a Lucy Calkins Teachers College Reading and Writing Project school. And when it was explained to me why my kids were struggling as readers, why 4 out of 5 of them were reading below grade level, I got a lot of homilies. Well, Mr. Pondiscio, it's because they're not engaged, because the books they read are not about them. It doesn't reflect their interests. We need to sell kids on reading. Hirsch, if he were there, would have said, no, it's background knowledge. It's because and look, I never had a single kid who could not read. They could decode. They struggled to comprehend, and Hirsch's work explains that like nobody else's work before or since. And it's hard to summarize briskly, but basically the way language works is literate writers and speakers make assumptions about what their listeners and readers know. And when those assumptions are correct, language works fluidly, and when they are not correct, it doesn't. The analogy I always use to describe Hirsch's work is, imagine the child's game of Jenga, where every little block is a bit of background knowledge or vocabulary, and you can pull out some of them and it's fine. And then what happens? You pull out one too many and the whole thing collapses. And that's what it's like to be a struggling reader who is missing crucial bits of context, of vocabulary, of background knowledge. It befuddles us as teachers, because we think, you're reading a passage and you ask a comprehension question. How could you not know the answer? It's right there in front of you. It's right in the text. But like that Jenga tower, at some point, all sense is lost because of these deficits in vocabulary and background knowledge. So Hirsch's work basically became my work. I've joked ever since I want to be his, spent 20 years being his John the Baptist, trying to, spread the gospel of E.D. Hirsch Jr. in core knowledge, because it at the end of the day is what those struggling 5th graders that I used to teach most badly needed and were not getting.
Do you find that you got or get pushback on this idea? And can you just tell us a little bit about, because you're making me think. So I used to teach foreign language. And so for a lot of that, it was obviously vocabulary. So, you see a word. Yeah. So if the word was to swim, nadar in Spanish, well, obviously, in order to know what nadar means, you need to know what to swim means. And with
this is the soul of Hirsch's work is about context. So think of the word swim. Okay, you're using it the way somebody with a limited vocabulary or limited language proficiency would use it, in moving through water on the surface. But what about if it's used metaphorically? Boy, I was teaching 5th grade in the South Bronx, and it was like swimming uphill, or in other words, there's a richness to language. You use analogies, you use comparisons, you use context. My favorite example is the simple word shot. Okay, that's what you and I as teachers would call tier 1 vocabulary, right? Every kid comes to school knowing the word shot, but that means something very different on a basketball court, on a rifle range, in the doctor's office. If the repairman tells you your refrigerator is shot, those are all different context specific uses of the word shot. So even if you know the word shot, even if you can read it, you don't really fully understand the word shot unless you have all that context, so you know which shot it is. In other words, the way to think of it is language is like an iceberg. Above the waterline is the 26 letters and the words that we make out of them. Below the waterline is all the context that can confuse kids, where you think, well, come on, these are normal everyday words, but they're just redolent with context and meaning that unless unless you're on the same page as the speaker or the writer, you meaning gets lost.
It's interesting that you mentioned that too, because just as a parent, I find that sometimes we're surprised at uses or words or things that we assume that our kids would have picked up by now and they haven't. And it's interesting to sort of try to peel back and figure out, why is it that this is so foreign to you?
Well, it's the hardest thing in the world, Erika. I've said this for years. Literate people are, the thing about like how a fish doesn't know what's in water. We have no idea how much language and knowledge we are just awash in. And we assume, again, this is Hirsch's point, that readers or that writers and speakers just simply make assumptions about what their audience knows because we are that fish that doesn't know what's in water. We are unaware of how much knowledge and vocabulary we just are carrying around like mental furniture, and we assume everybody else is too. So yeah, those disconnects happen all the time.
Okay, let's pivot a little bit. First of all, we're going to talk a little about the ed reform movement. It might even be helpful. It'd be interesting for us to even figure out what exactly is that? Like when we say the ed reform movement, what do we mean?
Is it still there?
And what was it? I guess I could say. And you've obviously been, you and I met largely because we had similar ideas around that. Certainly I was a longtime advocate for school choice. I was sitting on an elected school board and advocating for school choice, which made me really popular. Or maybe it's teacher evaluation, maybe it was, accountability, all these sort of buzzwords. And for a long time, it was sort of this it felt like this sort of bipartisan partnership, et cetera. So I do want to first, we'll talk a little bit about kind of what was that, and then just walk through, what were some of the successes of that? What have been some of the major failures? Because certainly even before the whole thing sort of feels like it blew up in recent years, and friends became foes, or people that you thought were friends suddenly became foes, or things like that. But there were even failures before it sort of collapsed.
I'm sorry. I was just forgive me for interrupting. I guess I'm doomed to be the skunk at every picnic that I'm invited to. So my reform credentials, I hope, are in good order. But I've been kind of a persistent critic, a friendly critic, I hope, of ed reform. And it gets back to some of the things we were discussing a moment ago. It was a surprise to me when I left the classroom, determined to be, as I say, Don Hirsch's, E.D. Hirsch's, John the Baptist, about the utter indifference within the ed reform movement to issues of curriculum and instruction. In other words, it was, if you think about what, and you enumerated some of them, Erika, what did the ed reform movement, concern itself with? Standards, testing, accountability, charter schools, teacher quality, all those things are fine. I have no issue with any of them. What's missing? Curriculum, instruction. What do the kids do all day? It was a surprise to me how incurious, mainstream ed reformers were about what the kids do all day, about curriculum and instruction, which from my perspective as a teacher was maybe the most important thing. So I kind of happened upon this, not because I'm a genius, but just by accident, just assuming that the ed reform world was as captivated by these questions as I was, and it turns out they're not. And you could argue look, hey, Common Core, wasn't that all about curriculum? Yeah, not really. That was about standards. That's not quite the same thing. But I've spent, going on 20 years now, basically trying to get the ed reform movement to take curriculum and instruction seriously as a reform lever. And it's still uphill work. I think there's still, if you think about the internal logic of the ed reform movement, right? In other words, it's basically the whole standards and accountability movement at least tacitly has assumed, oh, schools and teachers know what to do. It's our job to hold them accountable. In other words, we're going to measure what goes into that black box that is the classroom. We're going to measure what comes out of it. And based on that, we will either, scale up your success or try to right the ship or pay the teacher more, or maybe counsel that teacher out of the profession. But there's at least an assumption that what happens inside the classroom is all the same. And those of us who've been in the classroom, I always say, I hate to be the guy who waves the bloody shirt, and I don't want to be the guy who says, well, unless you've been a teacher, you don't understand these things. But sometimes, unless you've been a teacher, you don't necessarily understand that there are, serious differences in curriculum and pedagogy and classroom culture that make a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, so I taught in 3 states. I taught in public, I taught in charter, I taught in parochial. So I feel like I have had a lot of experience. And I've also taught in very affluent and high poverty schools, and what I sort of, first of all, to your point, is one of the reasons that I get so frustrated with some of these simple fixes, like just post the curriculum online. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, if it was only that easy, because
what curriculum?
In a much more affluent community, you're not under a microscope because you're already doing well. Those schools were generally testing well, that there was so much freedom and autonomy for a lot of the teachers, because again, it was so you could have one teacher who was obsessed with Teddy Roosevelt, right? So he might do these crazy long units about Teddy Roosevelt in his classroom. And the classroom right next door may not talk about Teddy Roosevelt at all. And these are listed as the same course on the transcript. And even we would see, kids would go, oh my God, I really hope I get this person and not this person, because it'd be the same AP class. And yet one was really tough and one was really easy, and they weren't covering the same things. This AP bio class at my high school was this guy would do this fruit fly thing for so many months. The other AP bio class never talked about a fruit fly.
But this is a really important issue, frankly, for you and for PDE, for Parents Defending Education. And again, I don't want to be that guy, but there's an assumption on the part of a lot of parent advocates and activists. You alluded to it, curriculum transparency, that that we should know what kids are learning. Absolutely, 100%, you should. Public schools, we are government employees at the end of the day. We don't think of ourselves that way, but we are public servants. We are government employees. We don't get to close the door and indulge ourselves. What we do in the classroom should be not a secret, right? Okay, so what does that mean? Curriculum transparency. I want to see the curriculum. Okay, great. Did you know that the vast majority of American teachers, and I mean the vast majority, 98% according to a RAND survey, use materials that they either create, curate, collect, customize themselves. So there's this idea out there that once you know the curriculum, you know what's happening in your child's classroom. Not by a long shot. And look, I don't know how to solve this other than having classrooms in the camera, and I'm not sure that's the best idea. But in a way, you could almost lull yourself into a sense of complacency, saying once I know the curriculum, once it's published, now I can rest assured as a parent that I know what's going on in my classroom. If you have that idea, let me throw cold water on it and divorce you of that idea. It is simply not so. The published curriculum look, in my classroom back in the day teaching the South Bronx, there was no curriculum, period. One of the reasons I became a curriculum advocate is because what I so desperately needed as a new teacher was in fact a curriculum, and we didn't have one. So that's one problem. The next problem is curriculum gets purchased and then it gets left on the shelf because teachers will decide, this is not appropriate for my kids. It's not developmentally appropriate. Some of the things we say. They're not ready for this. I can't use it. And then you go on, who's actually determining the curriculum in America's schools? Well, it's Google, it's Pinterest, it's teachers pay teachers. It's, stuff that teachers find on the internet. This idea that a school district adopts a curriculum on Monday and then on Tuesday, all the teachers go, yes, sir, and deliver it robotically. That world does not exist. It has never existed. It probably never will exist.
Now, what I will say that I saw over the years and in the change was that, like, for example, my district where I live and also the charter school where I worked, there was quite a bit of fidelity to curriculum. But part of it
Okay.
was because this is when ELA and math became the only things anybody cared about. So,
Yeah.
yes, the ELA and the math teachers and departments, they had a curriculum and they were fighting, over like, well, is it a script or is it a guide or um and so what ended up happening though was science and social studies and foreign language, they would tell you they didn't have a curriculum because it was almost like
Mm.
as the standards and accountability movement sort of like, I feel like I don't know, like it took center stage and people were really only being tested in those two subjects,
Yeah.
that became the focus. I certainly saw
Well,
that not only as a teacher, but for my own children. They came
yep.
up during the time that math and ELA were the thing. Um, and so understandably, science teachers would say, we're getting these terrible results on these state tests, but we don't even have a curriculum yet that aligns to the standards being tested on the state test. And like,
Okay.
as much as I wanted to be horrified that our scores were like 20% proficient in science, I'm also thinking it's a pretty important piece of the puzzle that they're not even being tested on things that the teachers like have a curriculum to use to
Yeah.
teach those things. So I guess my point, and I think you're agreeing too, is it's like this varies a lot, place to place, school to school, subject to subject. So while,
Well,
saying
yes and no. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so putting the curriculum online is obviously not the solution. It is one thing that could be done. But the
Yeah.
piece that is the other piece I would say is obviously any assignment you ever give to kids in a class, whether it's a thing that you pulled off Pinterest or you typed it up yourself, if a parent wants to be able to see it, there would never be a reason that they couldn't see the assignment.
Yeah. I look, I agree with that, and I don't care if this makes me unpopular with teachers, and I still think of myself as one first and foremost. I mean, I've said this a bunch of times. We're public employees. Behind me on the shelf is my master's portfolio from Mercy College, which I did 20 years ago, and I could page through there and I could show you. How in order to get my master's degree, in order to get certified in New York State, I had to, demonstrate certain dispositions, that I was, going to teach for social justice, that I was going to be an agent of change, and I had to document, my efficacy and all these things. It stuns me, Erika, in retrospect, that now what seems to me like something that I should have been told on day one never came up at all, literally never came up at all, which is this idea that, hey, Pondiscio, you're a public servant. You're a state actor. You are an adult with a tremendous amount of influence over a captive audience of other people's children. You need to be humble. This is not a platform for you to express yourself. This is not, your performance space. There are standards. There's baseline expectations because you are a public figure, so to speak. You're a state actor. In other words, there should be a tremendous amount of humility that is baked into this pie. I sometimes make a joke about this, which perhaps I shouldn't. I mean, no other category of public employee gets to act in the way that teachers take for granted. If I'm a bus driver in New York City, I don't get to wake up one morning and say, I'm going to drive this bus for social justice. I know that I'm assigned to the Upper East Side, but the Upper East Side has plenty of transportation options. I'm taking this bus to the South Bronx. You'd be fired. Same thing as a police officer. You don't get to decide, you follow procedures, so to speak, and look, I don't want to be, naive about this. Teaching is not picking up the trash. It's not driving the bus. It's a very different category of public employment, but it is public employment. So there is, a certain amount of latitude is baked into the pie, differentiated instruction and whatnot. But it is just kind of almost insane to me that nobody ever said to me what I thought in retrospect they should have said. This idea that you're a public employee, these children have parents, you need to work with them, not against them, etc. It's just the permission structures, as it were, that we grant ourselves as teachers are just unlike anything else in any kind of other public employment sector. And I hate to use the cliche about, like, the frog in water that slowly comes to a boil. We've gotten to I don't think I'm wrong to say we've gotten to the point where this is so baked in that teachers are almost surprised and even offended when they are told there are these things out there called parents, and they are stakeholders and they have a say in this, and you don't get to just shut the door and do what you want. So in other words, when you're saying, look, hey, you should trust me. What do you mean curriculum transparency, et cetera? We could talk at length about this. The trust relationship in public education is essential, and it's all on one side. We've just kind of drifted into this state of play right now, where teachers just assume they and not out of any ill intention necessarily. This is just the way this sector works. They make assumptions about what they have permission to do and not do that are parents are not wrong to say, hey, hold on a second. Where'd you get the idea that you get to, say this to my child or choose this lesson? Or, I'm not one of these people who thinks that it's all some grand conspiracy to indoctrinate kids, but I do think that permission structures in public education have gone under, or if not unscrutinized, for a very long time. And that's what's driving a lot of the tension we're seeing right now. Sorry, I think I completely drifted away from your point, Erika, but it's just,
it's okay, because so did I. Because so did I. But okay, so let's flip back a little bit to this idea of ed reform, because I do think that is an important conversation. It was a coalition that largely has fractured, and this parental rights movement is not a small part of that. So I think
it fractured over this. You can make a case that the ed reform movement fractured over parental rights. I've made the point over the years that the soft bigotry of low expectations never went away. We just, we can't apply it to children anymore. It's properly verboten to regard children that way, but we sure as hell regard parents that way. You worked in charter schools. I've worked in charter schools. I don't think I'm being outrageous to suggest that a lot of us in that world view parents as, if not exactly obstacles to what we're trying to do, then certainly not allies and not a source of help. In other words, we just assume, leave the parents here. We'll leave your kids here. We'll take it from here, mom and dad, because we have no expectations of you whatsoever. And that's wrong and offensive, honestly. But I think that was baked a little bit into, kind of the technocratic ed reform way of thinking. And that's kind of a sin of what we did. But I think it's not a surprise to me. Look, the reasons for this are somewhat obvious. I think COVID kind of pulled a lot of these relationships, put them under the microscope in ways they hadn't been before. But I think what we're having right now, and ed reform is a vector for this, but it's not the only one, is just this kind of, all the cards are on the table now, and we're questioning the relationships. Between parents are questioning their relationships with schools and teachers. Teachers are questioning their relationships with policymakers. Everything is in play right now in a way that it simply has not been in the 20 some odd years that I've been in this work. And maybe, it's a generational, realignment of kind of, interest and conflicts.
Yeah, one thing I think of a lot, I spent a lot of years in rooms with people who talked constantly about parent power, parent empowerment, parental autonomy. I don't remember if they exactly said parental rights, but it was essentially that, right? And so because they supported educational choice, they believed that families should have options for their children in terms of where they go to school, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their income. That was probably the thing that brought me into this world, was my belief, having grown up in a zip code that had very strong schools. I always felt like other parents obviously deserve to have the same options, or at least some options, right?
Mm-hmm.
Outside of whatever their residential address dictated. But what has been fascinating, and yes, sad, disappointing, etc., is that so many people who get paid a lot of money to spout off about parent autonomy, parent power, and parent empowerment suddenly have completely turned their
Right.
back on
Well, yeah.
parents, but on the parents that they decided by looking at them or hearing their opinion on one issue, well, not those parents.
Okay. Well,
I
look.
was always under the impression that it was that we just thought all
No,
parents.
no. I'm not saying suggesting you're naive, but this
Oh,
is
I
really
was. I
no, no.
absolutely think I was.
This gets directly to the ed reform, the sin, so to speak, of ed reform. I mean, and look, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but what was the ed reform movement all about? How did we manage to unite, in retrospect, what seems like ununitable forces, right and left, progressives, conservatives? Well, we agreed on one thing, that American education was failing badly, immorally, low-income children of color. The achievement gap. Think of the language of the achievement gap, which dominated education reform discourse for a generation. Well, that was the one thing that right and left could agree upon. My boss at AEI, Rick Hess, has written about this at length over the years. So we made common cause over that. But then, what was the effect of that? As part of this, this policy, the left, agreed not to call those of us on the right bigots, and we agreed, not to. We made these kind of bargains. But I think the after effect, I don't think I'm wrong about this, is that there's an assumption baked into ed reform and an entire generation of ed reformers, that ed reform is about equity, that ed reform is about racial justice, that it was just the ante, so to speak, to play in this game. That was your focus. And look, it's my focus too. It's what brought me into this work. I was concerned about the fortunes of the kids in the South Bronx that I taught. That's what motivated me. And I'd been involved in social services work in that neighborhood for years before I became a teacher. That said, I share your insight, Erika. Like, even though that was my motivation in getting into this work, at no point did I think that was the alpha and omega of it. In other words, it's not like I didn't care about education at large. I just recognized that it wasn't working in places like the South Bronx, and I wanted to do my part to address it. Well, fast forward 20 years, and suddenly, when people are using these vehicles for other means, you get parenting groups who are concerned about their kids who may not be Black or brown. Then suddenly, wait a minute, that's not allowed. This is, nobody says this, but I have this sense, and I'm curious if you agree, Erika, that there's just a lot of people whose tacit assumptions, like, wait a minute, the work of educational of ed reform is it's a social justice. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Social Justice Inc., as opposed to a broad brush effort to improve education outcomes at large. The ed reform movement probably started, with A Nation at Risk back in 1983, and that's language about if an unfriendly foreign power had imposed this rising tide of mediocrity on us, we would have viewed it as an act of war. But sorry, I'm nattering on here. But I think what made the reform movement happen was that short-lived agreement that both right and left were going to focus on closing the achievement gap on issues of racial justice. And somehow that turned into, all of this is only about that. And there's a lot of parents out there who said, well, listen, that's great, that's important, but what about my kid? And when you say, what about my kid, that does not make you a bigot. That makes you a parent. That makes you rightfully concerned, with your first priority, the child that you see at the breakfast table every morning. There's nothing wrong with that. There's everything right with that. We want parents to be concerned about their own kids.
So it will not surprise you to know I have a lot of feelings about this, because it's not just professional, it was personal. So a couple thoughts.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it makes yes, we cared a lot about low income children being failed by their school system, and that skewed towards kids who were Black and Hispanic. That's true. But that, to me, it never meant that you would like for me, it was like, you want parents to have options. Some parents are going to have them because they have them. They have the means or whatever. Other parents are going to need more policy changes because they're the ones that are more likely to be trapped. So
Sure.
from that perspective, I can see why people would have thought that's all we care about. But I have discovered a lot of assumptions were made that
Yeah.
were never the case. So, for example, when I apparently came out as a person who didn't support racially separating students and staff in schools.
Yeah.
And it was like, but Erica, what happened? You were an ally. Why are you using your whiteness in this way now? You were my friend.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, I have not moved. My feet have not moved.
Yeah.
I never, ever would have or did support the idea that we would literally separate students and parents based on their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation. So I'm thinking you made assumptions that I was on your team.
Yeah.
Well, I mean to say you made all these other assumptions about me. Well, what I was saying is I believe in educational freedom. I think that parents need options. Obviously, right now in the United States, the ones most in need of help getting those options are low-income families, largely Black and Hispanic, not exclusively. But the other thing that is so crazy to me about this, and then you said equity. Yes, I was on the equity bandwagon when equity had been explained to me as we give kids what they need and it's not always going to be the same. So equity means if you are a struggling reader, you get reading intervention. If you are not a struggling reader, you don't. And if you are an accelerated reader, you get more. So like to me, I think equity was meeting people. So it wasn't until it became this weird, like, well, we're going to have to get rid of honors and AP classes and we're going to have to lower the bar so everybody can meet it, which I'm thinking, how can you be in favor of social justice and say something so disgustingly racist?
Well, I mean, as a practical matter too, I'm just not convinced that it worked. I mean, first of all, now you've got me running my mouth, so I'll indulge myself. I mean, I'm a late convert to the world of choice. I'd be embarrassed to tell you how unsophisticated my views were about it. I didn't have views, when I became a public school teacher. Schools basically came in a few basic flavors. There was public, private, by which I would have assumed you meant Catholic schools, for example, because that's all I knew growing up on Long Island. I was very late, and I was well into my 20s before I understood there was this whole world of boarding schools and elite private college prep schools. I didn't know anybody who had ever attended one until I started working next to some of them as an adult. So I don't even think I knew what a charter school was until one opened up in my school in the South Bronx. I had to move my classroom to make room for it, and that was one of my first kind of through the looking glass moments where, my union chapter leader said, well, I'm not opposed to charter schools, but unless we could do this for every child, I don't think we should do it for any child. And I remember just laughing and literally saying, like, that's like saying if there's not enough lifeboats on the Titanic, everybody should drown. Like, who thinks this?
That's like saying if everybody can't go to Disney World, nobody can go to Disney World.
So I mean, like I don't think I've moved one iota. I mean, in other words, I got into this work because I cared about those kids in the South Bronx, and I still care about those kids in the South Bronx. I just simply have a different view of what it's going to take to help those kids and now their kids, frankly. In the South Bronx. My version of your story is a couple of years ago, when there was all this brave talk about dismantling institutions and whatnot, and what it meant to be an anti-racist and whatnot. I remember calling a friend of mine, a fellow teacher, and saying, okay, can you explain to me what this is all about? And she said, well, it's about holding kids to high expectations. It's about, expecting the same for your lowest performing kids as you do. So, and I said, well, so in other words, it's keep doing what I've been doing for the last 20 years. She said, yeah. So that was, but at no point, Erika, and this is the more serious point, I didn't sign up, and I've not spent one day in this work where I thought that it was my job to dismantle anything, and nor will it ever be. I mean, I recognize the obvious unfairness and yes, inequities in this work, and I set out to address them. Okay, no part of that is tear down, dismantle, disrupt. It's include, involve, make it work better. At the risk of being, a flag waver, I'm a third generation American. This country has been And my family has followed the playbook. My grandparents were low wage immigrants. My father was a mechanic who worked his way up. I'm the first in my family to go to college. It worked for me. I want it to work for other kids. No part of that of my interest is in tearing this down. My interest is in making it work more fairly.
And I also think that what I noticed that was sort of new that I hadn't seen in my teaching in the early years, but I began to see in these more recent years was the use of denigration and shame in classrooms and in policy. And so that was also where I found myself speaking up. And one of the ways that I've done that, for example, is like this idea that you denigrate and shame people for their immutable characteristics when they go to school, because it became, oh, I see, we're literally deliberately creating a hostile environment because we somehow think that this is in service of the greater good. So we're going to shame the boys for being boys. We're going to shame the people who are heterosexual for being heterosexual. Oh my God, you were born in this country? Well, we're gonna shame you for that too.
I get, have a limited amount of tolerance for culture war stuff. We can talk about that in a second. I am willing to take on faith the arguments from those who are ideologically committed here that when those things happen, when the shaming happens, oh, that's not what this is about. Okay, fine. Well, but then you need to explain why so many educators have interpreted it that way, and why that's happening in schools. This is the Pottery Barn thing. You break it, you buy it. In other words, if at some point your grand plan for racial equity, gender equity, if it keeps getting so badly bowdlerized and misinterpreted and misapplied, at some point that's on you. It's not enough. I see this in the curriculum fights all the time that I'm involved in, where when a curriculum fails, what's the first thing a publisher say? Well, it wasn't implemented with fidelity.
Implementation.
Right. So at some point, if your grand plan is so complex and Byzantine and sophisticated that it cannot be implemented well by ordinary men and women, because that's who we have in our classrooms, 3.7 ordinary people. If that's the issue, then at some point it's not the program. It's not the implementation. It's the program.
Totally agree. And I will actually like to say it's a great public opportunity for me to say that at a time where sort of, relationships fractured and some people became very vicious publicly, we had people that we thought were friends who suddenly became, just absolutely vicious. Robert has always had my back. I have always done my best to have his back. And it has been actually very easy, but I'm very grateful for that as well, because people can tell you, that when you step out into this space and into this world, like it is fulfilling and you meet wonderful people and you absolutely like do your best on behalf of children and families. But I believe, it is, it can be challenging. So it doesn't make you the most popular person. I believe, the saying is the skunk at the garden party. You and I should get matching t-shirts. Okay.
Yeah, well, the one last thing I will say on this is I think I kind of I basically ensured that I will never be invited back to teach at my last teaching gig because of a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago, which when all of this was kind of burning white hot. The title, and I don't generally set out to be provocative. In this case, I felt it was important. The piece was titled, "I have misgivings about antiracism. Can I still teach Black children?" Suffice it to say, Erika, the answer that question has been answered, and the answer is no.
Well, it's their loss. That's obvious. Okay. So since you just mentioned a piece you wrote, and I'm looking for a convenient segue to talk about media, this is perfect. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about media coverage of education. It has clearly changed, which isn't to say that it never had a bias, but it sort of seems obvious that there's what I see now in a lot of media coverage of education is blatant activism. It's like you don't even question sort of where some of the people stand. Are there, because I've gotten to the point where now if you read a piece in an outlet that you feel like is sort of often sort of pushing one perspective and it's not doing that, it's kind of like this, like, oh, cool, like this was a really interesting piece. Wow, it ran at this place. So one thing I want to talk about is just the coverage in general. And also, do you see the way the media covers education? And I would base it, let's like kind of start at COVID maybe.
Okay.
Um,
Well,
do
I
you
mean,
do
sorry.
you see that way it covers it as being partly responsible for sort of sparking this sort of new parental rights movement, which is very different than parental rights movements in the past?
Wow, lots to unpack there. I mean, first of all, I should just kind of, betray my priors or share my priors. I had a 20-year career in the news business before I ever set foot in a classroom. I did radio news. I worked for Time Magazine and Business Week in a public affairs setting. So in other words, I was kind of the guy. I joked that I was, Time Magazine's paid principal apologist for years. So when there was a controversy, it was my phone that would ring from the Times or the Post asking for a comment. So I've focused on these issues quite a lot in my adult life. So I mean, a couple of things. One, it's been both fascinating and a little depressing, honestly, to have a front row seat in journalism and in education, and watch both more or less kind of fall victim to the same way of thinking, which is this idea. You just described it as activism. And put a more generous gloss on it. So in journalism, it's the idea that, look, objectivity is a myth, so therefore we are not obligated to pretend to be objective. And in education, it's a similar thing. It's like, look, our job here is to ally with students as opposed to to be dispassionate in our delivery of subject matter. So both fields, at least in my time, have tended to kind of lean into what you were terming activism as opposed to trying to maintain sort of, more, what I would think is either journalistic or high academic standards. So I think that's endemic to both fields, especially among younger practitioners.
Let me interrupt. Can I interrupt just for one?
Sure.
I interrupt for 1 second too, because what I've noticed too is it's not, there's bias is right. There's going to be a bias that you can pick up on. But what I've noticed in reading stories, especially now that I have like knowledge of exactly what happened and then I'm reading about it, is that it's just getting basic facts wrong. So it's one thing to sort of like, maybe there's a big battle happening over a sort of highly sexual or sexually explicit text in a middle school library, and people can have different opinions about that, of course.
Yeah.
What I have been struck by is how the facts that are laid out in these pieces are just so often wrong. And if they're willing to change, like if they get called out or someone sends a message and they change it, it's a stealth edit. They don't acknowledge the mistake. They don't put any editor's note, which again, I'm kind of wondering is, again, which to move on to this larger point is like, do you see media? And the answer could be no. Again, playing a significant role in sort of this like explosion of parents from all backgrounds, all political persuasions saying, and again, I do think that COVID is where this sort of started, because it was like, it wasn't just the masking, or it wasn't just the closures in some places that were almost 2 years long, but it was the dishonesty. And then these hot button sort of controversial values laden subjects, not only being covered in school, but then being lied about when parents asked about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's a lot to unwind here. I think, media in general, and I'm going to paint with a broad brush, has tended to feed partisan fires as opposed to, even referee them, shall we say, in the last couple of years. So I think there's that. Do I think that media has driven it, has caused it? No, I think it probably has. Look, there's this partisan moment that we're having is not new. It goes from an acute to a chronic condition, but never goes away. Obviously, it's been burning particularly hot, in the last decade or so. Vis-a-vis schools, it was probably COVID. At the end of the day, I mean, look, for a decade before COVID, I was the guy who was, nattering on about the black box of the American classroom and trying to get, as I mentioned earlier, get ed reform people interested in classroom practice and curriculum and instruction. Well, when the gods want to punish you, they answer your prayers. So they sent COVID, and now suddenly there was no black box. It came every day onto kitchen tables all across America. So now parents were literally seeing, all day, every day, what their kids were doing in school. There was no mystery anymore. You didn't have to like go, plumbing through your kid's backpack for like, archaeological clues as to what they were doing all day. It was right on the laptop, right on the kitchen table. And look, in most instances, it reflected well on teachers, and they were dealing with difficult circumstances. And for some number of parents are like, wait a minute, what? Whether it was, just kind of like low bore, unchallenging assignments, or again, teachers kind of indulging their political priors. So I think it just kind of changed the relationship. And look, it's important, Erika, not to overstate the case. I'm as concerned as anybody about the level of trust or distrust. It's important to note that teachers are still among the most highly trusted professions in this country. But what's changed is that the number of, or the percentage of parents who say they have, a high, in other words, relative to other professions, it's still high, but the actual level of trust has come down. There's just no disputing that. And I think it's because the kimono has just been opened in a way that it hadn't before. And that just, with a lot of the assumptions that we made, like, oh, we're all on the same page, we all see the world the same way, that has become a harder position to defend. And two, you see it not just in media, mainstream media, but in social media. I like to point out like libs of TikTok, which people either love or love to hate. I tend to be the guy who says, look, I don't believe that every every one of 3.7 million American teachers has purple hair, earrings, and a pride flag in their classroom, or an Antifa banner or whatnot. That's not the way it is in most schools. That said, it shouldn't be quite so easy for libs of TikTok and other sites like that to find stuff every day. This all gets back to these permission structures that I was talking about earlier. So the veil has fallen. We just have a lens into our children's lives and into classroom practice that we just didn't have even 5 years ago.
What are your thoughts too about what I've noticed is a lot of quick dismissals, right? So a couple things too, because again, as a teacher and as a parent, what I also see is there's just been such a drastic change in the content, particularly content that's sort of like trickling down to these younger grades, right? So you have these sort of very, again, hot button issues. People have really different opinions about, parents have different feelings about when this is appropriate to discuss. Is it appropriate for a school to ever discuss, et cetera, et cetera. But what I've also noticed is that, and I see this a lot too in some of the people that you and I have known for a long time in ed reform world, is it immediately becomes like a dismissal, like, oh, why are they pushing these culture war issues? They're always talking about the culture war when we should be talking about, and they'll list something. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I don't really I get in the sense, like, if you just think people are throwing red meat out there because they want to inflame, then I see the critique. And there are people doing that, because in every situation, you're going to have people who kind of like move into that space and they are going to fling red meat, some of it legitimate, some of it not so legitimate. But on the other hand, like, to dismiss parent concerns about very serious topics as just like culture war nonsense, that seems very, very kind of unfair and also just wrong.
Yeah, I was smiling and smirking a little bit because whenever this issue comes up, oh, isn't it a shame that the culture war has taken over our schools? I always have the same somewhat puckish response, which is, do you know what we do in a school? Like, do you literally know what we do in schools? A school is a cultural institution. What I mean by that is we make decisions as adults, as teachers, as policymakers. What is it the kids need to know? Who are our heroes and villains? What are the behaviors that we praise and condemn? What are the books that we want you to read and know? And what are the ones? In other words, every decision that we have made ever since we built these things called schools are cultural decisions. In other words, the culture war didn't come for American education. We invented it. Okay, we literally make culture war decisions on behalf of children, and we have for hundreds of years. This is not new. What is new is now we're arguing about these decisions. And we are forced to confront how little we agree about some of these. So you what it's worth, Eric, this is another probably vestige of the ed reform era, which we were poorly served by. What's the kind of the biggest characteristic of the ed reform movement? It was very technocratic, right? It tried to align all of these things. It didn't want to take in other words, why could I not get the ed reform world in curriculum? They wanted nothing to do with these conversations, okay? Yeah. Which is educators were fascinated by. But if you're trying to, raise standards, you're going to decide what the curriculum is, you're going to make those decisions about books. We just want to measure the output. So in retrospect, it all makes sense to me. But the ed reform world has kind of tried to impose an almost values neutral, content neutral, technocratic vision of what education is. And look, I think that's why it failed, because you can't unwind these kind of values and culture issues from the educational product. It doesn't mean that it has to be a white hot argument, but you're just naive if you think that you could avoid these questions. This is literally what we do in schools.
And the thing that when you say that, it's also true, because it's like it seems like the critique is always that it's the parents who are upset that are sort of stoking the culture war. But I'm thinking to myself about a recent debate I had with my local school board chair. So, I thought it was weird that they thought that kindergartners in a lesson about body parts needed to learn the word vulva. The school board chair couldn't understand that. She couldn't understand that I thought that was weird. I checked in with a bunch of kindergarten teachers that I know. They all thought it was weird, not because they don't think children should ever learn about that anatomy in that specific way, but they couldn't understand how in the world you would ever think it was appropriate to be teaching those terms in kindergarten. So
where is the developmentally appropriate practice?
I didn't start the culture war argument here, right? You, a school board chair, took a position about curriculum. Maybe, that sort of started it, right? And now people can respond. So I think my position is this is a two-way thing happening. And yet it does feel like what I see a lot of is that the people that are upset or concerned or just have questions, some just have questions, that they get accused of sort of pouring gasoline on a culture war. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that fire kind of started with some of this content in some of these classrooms with some of these very young children.
Well, look, I mean, this you're not gainsaying my point. You're kind of reinforcing it. But if you conceive of a school as a cultural institution, and if you conceive of the job of education to make decisions on behalf of children, what do you need to know? What do we think is important? What do we praise and condemn, et cetera? Well, then that changes the tenor of the conversation you just described. Now the conversation is not, hey, you started it, you're the one who wants to teach body parts. It's, hey, at what age do we think it's appropriate to teach body parts? Now I don't want to be naive. I don't know that we're going to come to some kind of grand agreement about any of these things, but at least it's a clearer and more productive discussion when you walk into it conceiving of a school as a place where we resolve these or at least address these issues. Frankly, this is another reason why I become a school choice guy, because I don't know that they are resolvable. Some time ago, I wrote and I'm again a core knowledge, E.D. Hirsch, unrepentant core curriculum guy. But a few years ago, Colin Kaepernick, you know who he is, obviously, got Nike to withdraw a sneaker because it had the 1776 Betsy Ross flag on it, which he said was a symbol of oppression. And I remember writing a piece in Ed Week at the time that said, look, I'm a core knowledge guy, but if we are to the point where we cannot agree whether a piece of rock bottom basic American iconography is a symbol of pride or oppression, then it's kind of game over. We're not going to agree on what our children should know, and we're not going to agree on the values attached to it. So once you get to that point, then I think these questions of values and content can only be resolved by choice.
I absolutely, I mean, again, like as always, right? Choice isn't the silver bullet. It's not the panacea, but it's got to be part of the solution, because a person has to be able to, move their child in or out of a school based on their values, and regardless of what they are. Like, again, like if you're for like the really accelerated body parts unit in kindergarten, like there's a school for that. And
Right.
if you would just prefer head, shoulders, knees, and toes for 5-year-olds, there's a school for that. Um,
Yeah.
since but we're going kind of long, so I'm going to have to, unless you really want to say something about the Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, and his antagonism towards parents, which you don't. But if you want to quickly get something in, we can do that. Otherwise, I'm just going to wrap up.
No, I tweeted this yesterday because apparently there was a Politico interview where, which just seemed to not understand how controversial he is among parents, and to coin a phrase that he doesn't seem to want to be the Secretary of Education. He seems to want to be the Secretary of Educators, meaning, the lens through which he views education is what's good for teachers, and look, that's fine, that's legitimate. But I mean, those of us who view parents as significant players, the most significant player in children's outcome, I think he should spend a little bit more time talking to parents.
I'm actually starting to think that I'm almost like maybe his whole plan, or whoever runs his social media, because I'm not totally sure, but
Yeah,
consistently like poke parents in the eye intentionally. I'm like, is he? I'm like, maybe, since they know we're actually like not the crazy psychopaths that they keep portraying us as, maybe they're trying to.
Are you sure, Erika? Are you sure you're not a crazy psychopath? Because I hear tell.
Right. I mean, there are rumors. So it's like, maybe it's like, if we can provoke a reaction, then we can like make the case. See, we told you they were domestic terrorists. We told you, because otherwise his antagonism towards parents, again, not like as a whole, has just been unbelievable. Okay.
To put a serious pin in this, and then we can move on or discuss another time. Again, I alluded to this earlier. The principal actors in a child's education, the thought centers, as it were, are parents and teachers. And it's a pendulum who's kind of, has a greater influence. For years, teachers and schools have just made assumptions about the level of trust they enjoy, the level of the permission structures and what they get to do with other people's children, that are just being called into question. That's not unhealthy. It doesn't have to be antagonistic. There's going to be adversarial tension built into that, but it's not unhealthy to see that pendulum come back. And look, we will overcorrect, because that's what we do in education. So you will see parents making decisions on behalf of their children that may not be in their best interests, and who knows where this is all going. What I said before is where I net out on all this. It's a fascinating time to be in this work, because the interplay of these forces. There's never been a time where where the relationship of Americans to their schools has been more in play than it is right now, and I assume it's only going to get more unsettled, not less.
Yeah, the way that I put this like when this all started about 18 months ago, was that school boards and schools in general, they're just not accustomed to this level of scrutiny.
That's right.
For better or worse. Right. And so I think what happens is that the back goes against the wall when suddenly, you're kind of taking incoming. And even if it's really just questions, public records requests, concerns about really invasive surveys, the posture naturally becomes defensive. Sure. And so it's almost like it kind of started out with that sort of like a little bit unhealthy in that way. And having spoken to, state chiefs from all different states, like you can see, like there's a lot of people working in education who welcome this. There's a lot of people who feel, Penny Schwinn from Tennessee comes to mind. I mean, she is publicly speaks out on behalf of parents, on behalf of their right to know what's going on with their kids in school. So again, like because the everything's so binary in the reporting, there's going to be people watching who might think that there aren't any, educators or state commissioners or teachers or principals who 100% believe that parents have a right to know everything about, what happens in school with their kids. There are plenty of people like that. It doesn't feel that way as much because, unfortunately, I would say a lot of the hot spots that get the most attention, whether that's, things that the governor in California is doing, or whether that's a school board in Fairfax County, Virginia, that gets the attention. So you feel like everyone's against you, but they're not. And so there are a lot more opportunities to sort of rebuild some trust, build relationships, partnerships, etc. And so, because that is important, or else it starts to feel kind of hopeless, and it's not.
Yeah, look, the one change, if you give me the magic wand, and I can't be trusted with it. But if it should fall into my hands, the one change I would make in education, I think I alluded to this earlier, the culture of education needs to change, and teachers need to go to school in the morning with the clear understanding from day one: I'm a public employee, I'm a state actor, I'm not a free agent. That free agent culture, for good reasons, it has just gone too far. I think we could not solve. You're never going to solve these problems entirely, but I think we could mitigate them a lot if public educators conceived in themselves as state actors, state employees. I think it would be almost impossible to not have a lot more humility about the work if you consciously conceived of yourself not as a social justice warrior, not as an agent of change, but I'm a public employee. I mean, look, I don't want teachers to act like I'm going to work at motor vehicles. It's a different category of job. But if you conceive of yourself as, again, a public employee with an adult with tremendous influence over a captive audience of people's children who are not my kids, it just changes the dynamic.
I agree 100%. Okay, lastly, I'm sure people are now going to be wondering, how do I get more of this guy? So tell people where they can find you, how they can follow your work.
Ain't nobody wondering that, Erika. You don't lie to me.
Yes, they are.
There's my Twitter handle on the screen. My Twitter DMs are open. Or you can find me on Facebook or on Twitter, or email me, rpondiscio@aol.com. Do not make fun of my AOL address. I've had it for 30 years. I ain't giving it up.
We will make fun of it immediately right now. Okay. And also Robert writes a lot for different outlets too. So if you find, if you start following him, you'll be able to see some really great examples of writing. And actually, now that I'm thinking, maybe we'll add or just start sharing some links to some of the stuff that you've done when this, so that people can, get a better sense of your work. And again, what you'll see is somebody that's really fair, calls balls and strikes, not really playing for anybody's team. So if you like him today, great, but you might not like him tomorrow.
Like I said, I'm the skunk at all the picnics.
And with that, we could talk forever. There were other things I wanted to get to that we didn't. Maybe we'll end up for the first time having a repeat guest.
Any old time.
And it's great to see you. And thank you for all that you're doing. And to all of you watching, thank you so much for joining us for PDE TV. Again, I'm Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach here at Parents Defending Education. And just a reminder to you again, if you have questions, you need support, you're unsure of something happening in your children's school or in your school district, we are here to help. Thanks, everybody.